Please tell us about it.
Brilliant, thank you. So when I left IP Cortex earlier in the year, I promised my wife that I would take sort of 6 months off, and kind of reflect on life and not immediately dive into to something brand new. And after about 3 weeks, my head was about fit to explode because of all these things that I really, really wanted to attack, but never had time to attack them because I was busy running a telecom software company. So about 3 weeks in, I was sitting on a train. I decided to experiment with how easy it is to set up a new company in the UK. And it takes £12.50. You can do it in 2 minutes on a train. Thanks to the new Challenger banks, 2 or 3 days later, you can set up a bank account as well. So I set up a bank account, chucked some money in it, and started this thing called Applicate. So what I'm trying to do with Applicate basically is solve a bunch of problems around conversational AI. And there's one more TADHack link here because the whole idea behind Applicate came out of TADHack a couple of years ago, where I was developing something called Polite.ai, which was a classifier for chat messages, but I needed a little chatbot to sit inside there to do some stuff. And I had no idea about chatbots, no idea about conversational interfaces at that point. I was just learning AI and parsing conversations and that sort of stuff. So I went and had a look at what was around to develop chatbots in, and I found Google Dialogflow because that's what you find. I think back then it was called API.ai, but it was basically a way of doing things. There were other things around like Rasa, which is a brilliant open source project, which is quite good at intent recognition. But back then it wasn't as developed as it is now. So I set off building this hack and open source project using Google Dialogflow. So I was doing stuff like putting intents into a web interface and then somehow trying to pull a zip file down and put them in a Git repo so that someone could reproduce what I was doing. That didn't strike me as a particularly good idea. But at the same time, scaling the entire sort of learning curve to learn how to use Rasa and how to build Python pipelines to do intent recognition was kind of a bit beyond me as someone entering that market as well. So what I set off to do with Applicate was figure out how to kind of fix that problem so we don't lock ourselves into proprietary systems while we're trying to do conversational AI. But don't worry about the pitch for Applicate. Let's have a think about what we actually do when we're doing intent recognition, we're building AI systems. So if I want to build a chatbot, fundamentally, as David Curran told us yesterday, absolutely phenomenal presentation, is that what the chatbot is doing is recognizing intents. And this is the crux of the whole chatbot machine conversation bit. It's basically recognizing what the heck the human being is saying to us. So if I want to build an intent for something like, say I've got myself a restaurant chatbot that's going to respond to things like, actually, I really want an Indian tonight, or can you tell me where the nearest Chinese restaurant is? What I've basically got to do is find a way of training it for all the probably about 100,000 permutations of the way that someone might say, even in English, let alone if we bring American in or something. Find all the thousands of permutations of how I'm going to ask about a restaurant and where I might find one. So we end up with something like this where we try and enumerate all the phrases. And as David mentioned yesterday, a typical program will come along and say, okay, I'm just going to, I'll write a gravy if statement. If I hear the word restaurant, then there's clearly something going on there about restaurants. Complete waste of time. This is only really a problem that machine learning can solve by having a set of classified phrases about restaurants, throwing those in a machine learning engine, and what we get out of that is a set of probabilities. So that when someone utters something as our chatbot, the chatbot can basically make a decision out of a set of probabilities it has, what it's likely they were talking about. And intent, recognizing that intent is the major thing about chatbots and figuring them out. And the whole machine learning of taking a relatively small set of samples of people asking for something or human beings asking for something, and then managing to extrapolate that into the other 100,000 ways they might do it, is what intent recognition does. And the most important rule of conversational AI, because the number of times when you talk to folks, what they think is, hey, there's machine learning in here. And the one thing I know about AI and machine learning is just train it up on a bunch of stuff, and you throw some other stuff in and it'll figure it out. So, typical view of, I actually talked to a bank at one point that said we just want to feed all of our customer questions into a chatbot, and we just want you to build an AI that answers exactly the same as all the agents answer. Absolute recipe for disaster. Because you remember that bit about probabilities. AI works best, or machine learning categorization to be more precise, works best when we're assessing probabilities out of a relatively low number of outcomes. If you try and build a chatbot to, kind of feed Wikipedia into it and, have it answer every question on the planet, you're absolutely hosed. You're not going to get anything sensible out of this thing. So that isn't the way to do it. You can't think of this just because there's some machine learning in there as a sausage machine. No, unfortunately, there's absolutely no substitute to actually defining the sphere of endeavor, defining the set of questions that your chatbot is going to answer to be as small and as tight as possible. And if you do that, you've just got the slightest hope of generating something that's going to do something intelligent and not tell your customer they need a £2 million mortgage or something when they come to change their debit card. Okay. There are a few other things about building chatbots that are quite important. So intent recognition is the core of it. It's that probability of what did someone want to say, what's the person I'm communicating with, what do they want to say from what they're asking. But there are a bunch of other things. So that's great for tiny little chatbots, but we also have to know a little bit about context. So we've got to follow the flow and the ins and outs of the conversation. So if conversation starts about one particular topic and then it moves into something else, as human beings, we understand that. We know where we are in the conversation. We know that if we got ourselves into a conversation about, kind of push bikes or something, then some other thing about the speed we were going or something probably doesn't refer to a racing car. It probably refers to the context that we were in. So that's another part of how chatbots work. And then we have this idea of recognizing entities. So we do intent recognition. We do it within a context generally, and then within those sentences whose intent we're recognizing, we have these things called entities. That's just a grand way of saying variables. So when I utter something to a chatbot like, I want to change my debit card, there's a chunk of that which is, I want to change my, and then there's an entity there, debit card, which is a thing, it's a class of things. I could be saying credit card. I could be saying one of the other range of things that I want to talk to them about. I could say, can you call me back in a month, in an hour, in a day? And that's an example of an entity. It's a variable that the chatbot's going to pull out of the sentence. And then within an intent, we can have things called slots, which are basically entities that we absolutely have to fill. So there's no point getting to the end of the intent, hey, find me a restaurant. There's a couple of things I need to know there. Where do you want the restaurant? It'd be good to know whether it's in London or LA. And what kind of restaurant do you want to go to? So unless I've filled a slot, then my chatbot can't move on in its conversation. But they're the kind of fundamental things you build into a chatbot. So the real idea behind Applicé was to take that way of describing a chatbot, build a schema of a neutral language that allowed you to define how the chatbot operates, and then be able to both push and pull those chat definitions into the major platforms. And in that way, I'd be able to push something that I wrote, something that defined a chatbot that I want to use, into Dialogflow, rather than do it in Google's web interface. And you know what? If I want to pull something out I've pushed into Dialogflow, take it out into my platform neutral definition and put it into Rasa next month, because I don't want to send Google all of my data, or Amazon Lex. So there are a whole bunch of kind of advantages we get out of that. It sounded quite hard though, but I thought, yeah, we'll take a punt on it. We'll see what we get to. And the main thing is inventing this schema, because obviously the schema is the commonality between all those platforms. And we've kind of got to a point now where we've got a schema that works for Dialogflow, Lex, and outputs to Rasa. Rasa has a really nice set of, actually a beautiful system for describing chat called Stories. And pulling into the schema from Stories is proving a bit interesting right now. But defining that schema is quite important to the whole enterprise. And we've got a point where we're just about there with that, actually. So let me talk a bit about sort of progress. expecting that within a couple of weeks, Schema 1.0 and the API 1.0, so if I go back to this model here, fronting the natural platform neutral definition is an API that allows us to add intents, entities, contexts, and push them into those platforms. So the schema and the API are just about done. We've got Dialogflow import and export, Rasa export, and just sort of dotting I's and crossing T's on Lex. So within the next couple of months, they're going to be there. Now, the intent here actually is just to release that whole platform as an open source project. Because one of the things that it's really hard to do is say, hey, you don't want to put your conversational intelligence in all those monopolies over there. You should put them in ours instead, right? So that doesn't work terribly well. So the intent is that the project produces an open source schema and set of definitions that allow push-pull into all the platforms, and that's open source. You can take that, you can build it into your own product, you can do with it what you will. You can use it as one-shot, pull it, use it to drag your stuff out of Dialogflow and push it into Lex or Rasa once. The bit where I think we're going to add value and really the monetization path is the dialogue editor that operates on that neutral schema. So once you understand the neutral schema and you've got something which has got some traction, then the conversational editor is the next piece. That is going to start beataing start of January kind of time. So that once stuff is in that neutral platform, it can be edited and use that to work on conversations. And monetization, I think that's going to come from selling the editor as a SaaS product. But that's really when it's ready. What I want to figure out first is whether we can actually succeed in achieving that neutral chatbot description language that pushes and pulls from the different platforms. And yeah, that's 30,000-foot view of chatbots. Apologise for the sort of 30,000-foot speediness of it, yeah, that's a solution to the chatbot problem, and statement of the problem that hopefully will solve.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Rob.